Picture this. It's early morning somewhere in ancient East Africa, around 90,000 years ago, and a woman is moving through a patch of acacia trees, collecting leaves from the lower branches for a preparation she's been making since she learned it from her mother, who learned it from her mother, who learned it from someone whose name is lost to time but whose knowledge is very much not. She strips leaves from one tree, moves to the next, takes from that one too, spreading the harvesting across multiple plants rather than stripping any single one bare. She probably doesn't know the word sustainable because the word hasn't been invented yet, along with everything else. But she knows from accumulated observation transmitted across generations that the trees you strip bare tend to produce bitter, useless leaves the following season, while the trees you harvest lightly tend to keep giving. What she almost certainly doesn't know, and what would have seemed quite strange if someone had told her, is that those acacia trees are not passive recipients of her leaf collection. They're doing something. Not something visible, not something she could detect with any of her senses, but something measurable, something that looks, from a certain scientific angle, disturbingly close to a coordinated response to being eaten. The trees she's harvesting are releasing chemical signals into the air. Neighboring acacias, trees that haven't been touched at all yet, are detecting those chemical signals and responding by increasing the concentration of tannins in their own leaves, making themselves more difficult to digest before any harvester even reaches them. The forest is, in some meaningful chemical sense, talking, and the question that follows from this, the one this entire video exists to properly investigate, is one of the stranger ones that modern science has produced. Can plants actually feel pain? Stick around because the honest answer is considerably more complicated, considerably more interesting, and considerably more unsettling than either a simple yes or a simple no can capture, and by the end of this, your relationship with salad might be philosophically awkward in ways you weren't prepared for this morning. First, the framework issue deserves direct address because it determines everything that follows. Pain, as most people understand the word, involves two distinct components that are worth separating clearly. There's nociception, the physical detection and response to potentially damaging stimuli, a mechanical signaling process that identifies tissue damage and triggers responses aimed at avoiding or limiting it. And there's the subjective experience of pain, the felt unpleasantness, the suffering component, what philosophers of mind call qualia. The quality of what it's actually like from the inside to be in pain. These two things often travel together in animals with nervous systems, but they're separable in principle, and the distinction matters enormously for the plant pain question. Plants, as everyone knows, lack nervous systems. They have no neurons, no brain structure, no centralized processing architecture, anything like what pain experience appears to require in animals where we're most confident such experience exists. What plants do have is a remarkably sophisticated electrochemical signaling system that in some specific limited ways functions analogously to aspects of animal nervous systems, without being structurally anything like them. Understanding what that system actually does and what it doesn't do is the core of this entire conversation. When a plant is physically damaged by being bitten by an insect, stripped by a herbivore, or cut by a stone tool, it responds. The response is measurable, specific, and in some cases quite rapid. Electrical signals propagate from the damaged site through the plant's vascular system. Calcium waves spread through cellular tissue. Specific genes activate. The production of defensive compounds, things that make the plant taste unpleasant, become difficult to digest or directly toxic, increases in concentration. None of this requires a nervous system. It's electrochemical, distributed, and driven by molecular machinery rather than neural architecture. But here's where it gets interesting. The speed and specificity of some of these responses has surprised researchers consistently. Plants don't just respond to damage locally, only at the site where the damage occurred. They respond systemically, with damage at one leaf triggering defensive preparation across the entire plant, including in leaves that haven't been touched at all. The acacia signaling we described in the opening scenario represents an even wider version of this. chemical signaling extending between separate individual plants across the shared air column, with undamaged neighboring plants responding to volatile compounds released by damaged ones. This long-distance signaling, both within individual plants and between separate plants, is one of the most consistently discussed aspects of plant behavior in the research literature. Various species release specific blends of volatile organic compounds when damaged by specific types of herbivores, and neighboring plants of the same species demonstrably respond to those compounds by upregulating their own defensive chemistry. The response is specific enough to carry information about the type of threat rather than simply signaling something bad happened generally, which suggests a degree of signal complexity that goes beyond simple chemical diffusion into something resembling, in a very loose and heavily qualified sense, communication. The communication framing makes many plant biologists uncomfortable, and for defensible reasons. Communication, in the strict biological sense, implies something about information transfer between sender and receiver in a context where both parties are engaged in some form of adaptive information exchange. Whether volatile compound release and neighbor response constitute communication in this sense, or whether the responding plants are simply eavesdropping on chemical information that wasn't specifically directed at them, remains actively debated. The distinction matters because it affects how we think about the degree of intentionality, if any, involved in the signaling process. Ancient humans, interacting daily with plant communities across diverse environments, would almost certainly have noticed aspects of this chemical ecology without having any framework for understanding its mechanism. The bitter taste that develops in plants after extended herbivore pressure, the way certain foraging areas seemed to go bad after intensive harvesting, the fact that plants in different locations with different harvesting histories tasted differently, all of these observable phenomena were likely incorporated into practical foraging knowledge without anyone understanding the underlying chemical signaling driving them. The woman harvesting acacias at the beginning of this video had arrived at harvest rotation practices through exactly this kind of accumulated observational knowledge, noticing outcomes without understanding mechanisms, which is often exactly how ancient practical knowledge worked. Now, the pain question specifically, what would it actually take for a plant to feel pain, not just respond to damage mechanically, but actually experience something like the subjective unpleasantness that pain involves for animals where we're relatively confident it exists? The standard scientific answer is that it would require something like a nervous system, or at minimum, some kind of centralized processing architecture capable of producing the kind of integrated, evaluative neural state that subjective experience appears to require based on everything neuroscience has established about the physical correlates of consciousness in animals we're most confident about. Plants don't have this. Their responses to damage are distributed, localized, and molecular rather than centralized, integrated, and electrochemical in the way neural processing is. This is the core of the scientific consensus that plants almost certainly don't feel pain in any phenomenally meaningful sense, whatever sophisticated responses to damage they produce. But several researchers pushing at the edges of this consensus have raised points worth taking seriously. Not because they think plants definitely feel pain, but because they think the obviously no case closed confidence that many scientists express oversimplifies a question that has more philosophical depth than it initially appears. The hard problem of consciousness we discussed in our animal awareness video applies here with even greater force. We don't actually understand why any physical process produces subjective experience in the cases where we're most confident it does, which makes it genuinely difficult to draw a principled line at which complexity of information processing definitely does or definitely doesn't produce some form of experience. The distribution of nervous system architecture across the animal kingdom itself complicates confident dismissals. Sea anemones have rudimentary nervous systems and respond to damage in ways that look behaviorally similar to pain avoidance in more complex animals. Jellyfish have nerve nets rather than centralized brains, and still demonstrate damage response behaviors. At what point in this decreasing neural complexity do we say the lights go out on subjective experience? The honest answer is that we don't know. And the honest answer to the plant question, at minimum, should acknowledge this uncertainty rather than asserting confident knowledge about where the boundary falls when we don't actually understand the fundamental mechanism well enough to place that boundary confidently. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this: plants have sophisticated damage detection and damage response systems that are considerably more complex, faster, and informationally richer than most people realize. These systems process information about the type, location, and extent of damage, generate systemic responses calibrated to the specific threat, and in some cases produce signals that influence the behavior of neighboring organisms. This is genuinely impressive biological machinery that has been seriously underestimated in popular understanding for a long time. What we cannot say with confidence is whether any of this involves anything it's like to be the plant, any felt experience of the damage occurring, any suffering in any sense that connects to the way pain functions in the animals where we're most familiar with it. The evidence currently available doesn't support a confident yes, and the mechanistic understanding of consciousness available to us doesn't provide a reliable method for confirming or denying it at the level of plants. There's a specific research thread worth spending time on here that has generated substantial popular interest and an appropriately cautious scientific response. Studies suggesting that plants exposed to various forms of anesthetic, the same compounds that disrupt consciousness in animals and humans, show reduced responses to damage and stress. This finding has been interpreted by some as suggesting that plants have something to anesthetize, some form of consciousness or experience that these compounds affect, while others have argued that anesthetics affect various molecular and electrochemical processes in plant cells in ways that don't require any consciousness to explain. The debate around this finding illustrates a recurring pattern in plant intelligence and consciousness research. The same observable phenomenon, plants responding to anesthetics, is consistent with multiple interpretations ranging from plants have some form of consciousness that anesthetics suppress, to anesthetics affect plant cellular machinery in ways that don't imply anything about consciousness. Choosing between these interpretations requires a principled theory of what consciousness actually is and how it relates to specific physical processes. And that principled theory doesn't currently exist at the level of resolution needed to adjudicate the plant question definitively. Ancient humans navigating the practical challenges of food gathering, medicine production, and resource management had their own implicit relationship with this question, not as a philosophical problem, but as a practical one. The knowledge that extensive harvesting produced degraded plants while moderate harvesting produced healthy, productive ones was practically equivalent to treating plants as responsive organisms whose condition could be improved or worsened by how they were treated. Whether this constituted any form of belief that plants experienced something isn't recoverable from the evidence, but the behavioral pattern of careful, conservative, rotating harvesting that characterized ancient forager relationships with plant communities reflects a practical framework that respected plant responsiveness even without any formal understanding of its mechanism. Various traditional and indigenous knowledge systems around the world maintain explicit beliefs about plant awareness, sensitivity, or something resembling experience. Beliefs that are often dismissed as unscientific animism by Western scientific frameworks, but that in at least some cases track genuine biological phenomena rather than pure projection. The belief that plants respond to being harvested respectfully versus disrespectfully, held in some traditional frameworks, might be an experiential encoding of real observations about how plant chemistry responds to harvesting patterns, expressed in a conceptual vocabulary that sounds mystical, but encodes empirical content about plant behavior that formal science has been measuring from a different angle relatively recently. This doesn't validate all traditional plant beliefs as literally accurate descriptions of plant phenomenology. It suggests something more modest and more interesting. That careful, extended observation of plant behavior across generations produced practical knowledge that was sometimes more accurate than the dismissive, plants are passive, inert objects with no relevant inner life framework that dominated scientific thinking for most of the 20th century. The ancient woman rotating her acacia harvesting was operating on better practical plant biology than anyone who assumed plant damage responses were too simple to be interesting. The Mimosa pudica example is one of the most discussed and most interesting cases in the plant behavior literature, precisely because it's visible, immediate, and behaviorally striking in ways that most plant responses aren't. Mimosa pudica, the sensitive plant, folds its leaves rapidly when touched, a response visible to the naked eye that happens in seconds rather than the hours or days over which most plant defensive chemistry changes operate. What makes research on this plant particularly interesting is that when plants were exposed to repeated harmless stimulation, they stopped responding to that stimulation, apparently learning that it represented no threat. This habituation persisted for weeks even after the stimulation stopped, and the plants retained the information about the non-threatening nature of the original stimulus even after being disturbed by genuinely threatening stimuli that reset their responses to other things. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Habituation to repeated harmless stimuli is one of the simplest forms of learning in the animal kingdom. Observed in animals from simple worms up through vertebrates, and its presence in a plant without a nervous system raises the question of what molecular mechanism is producing it and whether that mechanism shares anything functionally significant with neural mechanisms for habituation in animals. The research on this has been fascinating and cautiously received, with most scientists comfortable saying Mimosa pudica shows a cellular-level learning analog, while being deeply skeptical of interpretations that extrapolate from this to anything involving experience. For ancient humans who encountered Mimosa pudica or similar species with rapid visible responses to touch, this would have been a striking and memorable plant behavior, the kind of thing that would have entered oral culture, been discussed around evening fires, incorporated into whatever frameworks each specific ancient culture maintained for understanding the natural world. The visible immediate response of a plant to being touched looks, from the outside, remarkably similar to what pain avoidance looks like in animals. Whether that similarity reflects genuine kinship in underlying mechanism, convergent evolution of similar behavioral outcomes through very different mechanisms, or simple visual coincidence is exactly the kind of question the evidence doesn't currently answer with confidence. One of the most consistent findings in plant behavior research that has genuine practical implications for how ancient humans interacted with plant communities is the specificity of plant responses to different types of damage. Plants respond differently to being eaten by different species of insects, producing different defensive compounds calibrated to the specific chemistry of each herbivore's digestive system. They respond differently to mechanical damage, wind, physical tearing, versus biotic damage, actual herbivory, suggesting the detection system distinguishes between types of physical interaction and responds with appropriate, rather than generic, defensive measures. This specificity is significant because it implies a degree of information processing that goes considerably beyond simple damage has occurred, alarm signaling. Something in the plant's biological machinery is apparently distinguishing between categories of damage in ways relevant to producing appropriate responses, not just responding to damage generically, but categorizing and responding to damage specifically. Whether this distinction requires any form of information processing that resembles cognition in any meaningful sense, or whether it's better understood as sophisticated molecular chemistry, operating without anything like information processing in the cognitive sense, is another of the boundary questions this field consistently encounters. For ancient plant medicine, which we've discussed in various earlier videos in the context of ancient healing practices and food safety, the chemical diversity and specificity of plant damage responses created both opportunities and hazards. The defensive compounds plants produce in response to damage often have biological activity in human and animal physiology, which is part of why so many medicinal plants produce their active compounds most reliably in damaged or stressed tissue. Ancient healers harvesting medicinal plants weren't necessarily aware that they were harvesting plant stress responses, but the practical knowledge about when to harvest, from which plant parts, under what conditions, that accumulated across generations was effectively tracking the distribution of these damage response compounds across plant tissue and time without anyone understanding why those patterns existed. The question this video is built around, whether plants can actually feel pain, sits at the intersection of multiple genuinely difficult problems. The hard problem of consciousness, the definition of pain as either nociception or subjective experience or both, the question of what kinds of physical architecture are necessary or sufficient for experience, and the practical question of what the observable sophistication of plant damage responses actually implies about plant inner life, if anything. None of these problems have clean current answers, which is what makes the question simultaneously frustrating for people who want a simple yes or no, and fascinating for anyone willing to sit with genuine uncertainty. What the evidence clearly supports is that plants are considerably more sophisticated in their responses to damage and their information processing about threats than the passive object model most people carry assumes. The signaling, the learning analogs, the cross-plant communication, the response specificity, all of these represent biological capabilities that deserve serious attention and genuine respect, regardless of whether any phenomenal experience accompanies them. What the evidence doesn't currently support is confident assertion that plants feel pain in any sense that connects to how pain functions in the animals where we're most confident about the subjective experience component. The absence of nervous system architecture, combined with the absence of any principled theory that would predict experience in the absence of such architecture, makes plants feel pain like you feel pain, a claim that runs considerably ahead of available evidence. The honest position, which is also the most scientifically accurate and most philosophically defensible position, is that plants detect damage, process information about that damage in sophisticated and often surprising ways, produce responses calibrated to specific types of threat, and influence their neighbors through chemical signals in ways that resemble communication enough to deserve investigation, while the question of whether any of this involves subjective experience remains genuinely, possibly permanently uncertain given the current state of consciousness science. That ancient woman rotating her acacia harvesting across multiple trees, working with plant communities rather than simply extracting from them, had arrived through accumulated practical experience at a behavioral relationship with plants that implicitly respected their responsiveness without requiring any formal theory about whether they suffered. Perhaps that practical respect, grounded in observed outcomes rather than philosophical positions about plant consciousness, is the most sustainable relationship with the question that any of us, ancient or modern, has access to.